All right. Good morning, everybody. Somehow I don't see me, but hopefully you guys can see me.
We can
It's
see
so great
you.
to, yep, all perfect. Thank you. It's so great to see all the community come together. So hopefully everybody's staying warm this morning. Okay, one second. Okay. All right, and I think we can get started. We have already kind of it's hard to see how many people we have here, but we have close to 230 people registered. So great to have all our network back here. So anyway, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first World Trade Center Denver trade briefing. For any of you who don't know me, my name is Tanya Arndt, and I'm a director of new programs here at World Trade Center Denver. We're so excited to launch this series to provide timely insights. As we know, things change so quickly. And for those of you who are new to World Trade Center Denver, our mission is to help businesses navigate the complexities of international trade through education, connections, and resources. And the main goal of these briefings is to inform and offer a variety of perspectives and angles from different trade professionals so that we can all make better decisions and stay prepared and stay informed in this trade landscape. These sessions will be recorded, and the recordings will be sent shortly after each briefing. So don't worry if you miss it or you have to miss it. We will send the recording, but make sure that you register so we know who to send it to. The format will be 30 to 45 minutes briefing and then followed by 10 to 15 minute Q&A. The next one is scheduled for February 18th, which is next week already. So a couple of housekeeping notes before we start. This session is set up as a webinar, and there are two ways to engage. The very first one is the chat, so you can just comment some things that you hear here. But if you have questions, please put them in Q&A section, and we'll address them when we have the Q&A time. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tom Cook, Managing Director of Blue Tiger International, a business consultancy specializing in supply chain management, trade compliance, and global logistics. With over 35 years of experience in import and export operations, Tom has worked with companies around the world and is a member of New York District Export Council. He also serves on the board of the National Association of District Export Councils and is the director of the National Institute of World Trade. He's also World Trade Center Denver member and the past speaker at the World Trade Day. And now I'm going to pass it on to Tom. Thank you so much for being our first speaker.
Thank you, Tanya. Very much appreciate everybody's kind attention early in the morning. Though I'm based in New York, I'm actually broadcasting from South Florida today. So the intent of the conversation is kind of having a conversation about what's going on in Washington as it relates to the tariffs that Trump is putting out, and kind of framing the issues and concerns. And also, more importantly, is providing you with some concepts of how to deal and navigate with these things and what we call supply chain solutions. I run a company called Blue Tiger International, and we're supply chain management consultants. We go back more than 35 years in our tenure, and we basically help companies navigate all the challenges of international trade. Over the last 4 years now, we've been involved with World Trade Center of Denver. We enjoy a number of clients in that greater Colorado area now. When we're having a conversation, particularly talking about the current administration and President Trump, it's very difficult not to sound political in our conversations, but I just want you to realize that I try my best to be apolitical but it's very hard when you're talking about particularly Trump and particularly a lot of things that he's doing. The one thing certain about now having a conversation about President Trump and the administration, the one thing that's certain is really uncertainty. He's created a tremendous amount of uncertainty in global supply chain, not only for Americans, but for the whole world that trades with our country. And depending upon their modes of transit and the nature of their products and so forth, we've obviously been hearing lots of different things that have been going on. So I'm going to try to decipher that to the best that I can. We've been given this type of presentation since almost he got elected in November. So we've tweaked it over the period of now almost 4 months. And there are times when we start a conversation at a particular time, almost an hour later, things could have already changed based upon what the administration puts out. So appreciate the fact that a lot of people are using the terminology, well, we have a new sheriff in town. And a lot of people even brought that up when he took in his first administration in 2016 and 17. And appreciate the fact that in those years, when we look back of actual steps that he took, not just rhetoric, but actions that he took, is he put in 2 sets of tariffs that had a huge impact, and there's a residual impact on those to this day. He put the 232 tariffs in place, which attacked steel and aluminum from 17 different countries around the world, and they were maintained during his tenure. But when Biden came into office, he significantly modified the 232 tariffs to make them really ineffectual. But he also put in 2018 what was called the 301 tariffs, which was specifically targeted at China. About 40% of what in America we import from around the world comes in from China, so it's a huge amount. And almost about half of that amount fell into this category of 301 tariffs, mainly industrial products and some consumer items. And he put on a tariff surcharge of 25%. So if you had a product that normal duty rate was 4.5%, you now bring that in at 29.5%. And that was obviously hugely impactful. It took companies almost a year or so to figure out how they were going to manage that. And a lot of them passed the costs off eventually down the line to their buyers or their consumers. And a lot of people who study the economics of the world and the United States will tell you that a certain portion of the inflation that we face every day now for the last 4 years is coming out of the fact that we're paying 25% more for a significant amount of products that come out of China. So he used those tariffs as a weapon, okay, as a point of negotiation. And if you may remember, if you're paying attention to the news several weeks ago, his ICE teams, the customs officers who were going after the immigration issue and bringing back immigrants with felony and various criminal elements back to their countries, Colombia refused 2 aircraft coming from the United States, bringing back these aliens to their country. On a Saturday morning, Trump threatened Colombia with 25% tariff that he was going to impose by the end of the day. And within hours of that, the president of Colombia acquiesced and allowed the airplanes to land. So again, if you think about the means justifies the ends, in this particular case, the tariffs were used successfully in accomplishing the concept of getting certain illegal aliens back to the country of their origin. So we now know that he uses it as a weapon in terms of achieving specific results, and he also uses it as a negotiation strategy, meaning that we have to pay attention to the rhetoric because certain things are just rhetoric and they're not really going to be substantively put forward, whereas other things actually will be. When Trump first became really highly politicalized in the mid-2000s, And before he announced he was running for president, he had put out this book, Trump, the Art of the Deal, which I read because I teach negotiation, and also I'm always negotiating myself on behalf of our company and our clients. And it's a very interesting read. I take exception to a lot of the things that he puts in there, but one of the things that came into vogue to me back then, and it now resonates today, is what we call throwing in salvos. So I come out of the military, and in the military, a salvo was used. An example would be if you were in a field of combat. In the field of combat, you knew that somewhere in the forward positions was the enemy, but you weren't exactly sure where they were. You might send a certain amount of mortar fire into various spots to see where you actually made a hit, and where that hit was now known where the enemy was. So you kind of use it as a research tool where you're sending these salvos in. And a lot of the rhetoric that he puts forth, he uses salvos, and he believes as a strategy of negotiation, sometimes you've got to create a disruptive event with your adversary in order to get them off canter, and you'd have a higher degree of success in the negotiation. I don't personally believe that that's the way negotiation should run, but in fact, he has a successful track record of using that methodology. So it's important to understand how Trump thinks, to understand how he moves forward. That impacts all of us, the ones that are involved in international trade and supply chain. One of my analysts who was doing some of the work in trying to figure out how we were going to present all this thing came across this lighthearted comic strip here, which I just put here because we have such a serious conversation going on, but just to bring in a little bit levity here was the purpose of showing this. So when we look at the whole concept of tariffs, and I don't want to ever assume that everybody understands exactly what tariffs are, but appreciate the fact that one of the primary responsibilities of tariffs, and why countries like the United States and all countries around the world have duties and tariffs, is that it's a source of revenue for that country. If you were to walk into a U.S. Customs office anywhere in the United States, over their door, they have the sign, the first U.S. government agency, November such and such, 1789. And in reality, after our forefathers put together the Constitutional Convention and came out now with the United States of America, the first government agency that was actually formed was U.S. Customs, because the government needed money to operate in. So what better way than to start to put duties and tariffs on imports coming into the United States. So in fact, that it was the first government agency, and it's a very important aspect for the U.S. government, as it is for all other governments around the world, to earn revenue to pay their bills and obligations. Another reason that tariffs are put into place is to control trade and protectionism. We have a lot of industries here in the United States that get protected and have surcharges and tariffs and anti-dumping duties and things like that that's put on it to help protect U.S. industries. We have certain things in the furniture industry, in the shoe making industry, butter, certain dairy products, sugar, and so forth. There are controls put in place so that if you go outside those controls, you pay an extra duty or surcharge onto your cost of importing. So it's a means of protectionism and so forth. And that is part of what Trump is trying to accomplish, is protecting certain U.S. industries and kind of forcing the concept of bringing back manufacturing to the United States and not to look overseas for everything that we want to buy. And then it's utilized as a negotiation strategy for other results. And obviously the example of Colombia that we mentioned earlier would be a perfect example of that. When we look at what actually determines the duty rate, we have to look at the origin of the goods, where the country it's made from, not the country it's shipped through, but the country it's actually made in or made from, okay? We look at the harmonized tariff number. That's the 10-digit code that's assigned to the products, and the first 6 are common to the whole world. The last 4 can be customized country by country. but you look at a bar chart, one side is the origin, the country of origin, the other side of the bar chart is the tariff rate, and where the 2 points meet, that's the duty rate. And most countries around the world, including the United States, operate on that basis of figuring out what that duty rate is. Trump's come along and he's added a surcharge on that in certain areas, which we'll talk about. Again, you have to think about the strategy that Trump works with. He believes that you have to negotiate from a position of strength. And he also is thinking in terms of our military, that with a strong military and an aggressive posture is the way to prevent wars as well. So as you see Trump manipulating and moving through his political decisions, what he's doing, it's all based upon the fact of the American strength of our military, one that is current and one that he's continuing to invest in, okay? And that's the best posture forward in order to prevent wars from happening. So more specifically, in trying to look at what Trump is doing, we know that he has a mindset, and he's made it very clear that Americans should think about decoupling themselves from China. Our position on this as professional consultants in international business and global sourcing and supply chain internationally is a big part of our business, is that while companies need to look carefully at China, the idea is not to eliminate China, but really to reduce your dependence on China would be a better strategy to look at, okay? So a lot of his actions have been aggressively on China, and more specifically, a 10% additional duty rate. So on top of the initial duty rate, on top of the 25%, if it's applicable, he's added another 10% onto that on goods that are coming out of China. He aggressively went after Canada and Mexico with 25%, but he's pulled back on those because of the fact that they complied with what he was really trying to accomplish. When he went after Canada and Mexico, the goal wasn't to get additional duty rates. What his goal was to get them to be more aggressive and hold a more stronger posture on helping the United States deal with the immigration problem in our southern and northern border, along with the illegal drugs and illegal aliens that move through the border. And appreciate the fact that within hours of putting the 25% surcharge on Mexico and Canada, Mexico acquiesced and brought 10,000 troops to the border to help supplement the efforts, okay? And Mexico waited about a day and a half, but they acquiesced as well. They didn't bring 10,000 troops to the border, but they brought the equivalent of 10,000 troops in additional resources to their border to create a higher level of security and preventive measures to prevent illegal aliens and drugs from coming into the country. He's also put restrictions in certain regards into foreign trade zones and how benefits can be achieved in foreign trade zones, really putting restrictions on goods that originate from China that goes into foreign trade zones. He also went after the de minimis rule. The de minimis rule is that companies that bring things in that individually come in as an individual item that are $800 or less in value don't have to be customs cleared and no duty gets paid. Companies like Alibaba, Shine, Temu, Amazon to some extent have taken advantage of those rules. If we go back 10 years ago, there was less than 1 million transactions a day of de minimis coming into the United States. Today, as we get into February of 2024, there's close to 4.5 million transactions a day. So it's grown dramatically. So he restricted de minimis from Canada, Mexico, and China. But as we know, he lifted that relatively quickly. He is now evaluating. He had a discussion in an interview with the press 2 days ago, where he reiterated that he has his team looking at countries that have an unfavorable balance of trade with the United States and also have certain duties in place on goods coming from the United States going to that country. And he's announced that he's identifying that list and he's going to go after those countries and add additional tariff on those products that come into the United States. So we're waiting to hear what countries they may be. I'll share with you in a moment where we think that might be. Part of understanding Trump is his views on certain aspects of international politics. One is that he believes that the NATO organization, which we belong to, and we're the most senior member of the organization, and it's all countries that are in Europe that have touch points to the Atlantic Ocean, Canada, the United States, and so forth, is that these countries have agreed after World War II to say if one country is attacked, then it's an attack on all the other countries. And they have developed their own military capability, their whole military structure and so forth. And the problem that Trump has raised, both in his first administration and again now in his second, is that the Americans are paying the greater share of NATO. And though we don't have the greatest impact of cause of concern, really it should be Europe that has more concern about this, and they need to pay their fair share. So he's going after those countries that are not paying their fair share. And there are agreements in NATO that they have to pay a certain percentage of their GDP, and most of them are not doing that. If you're also paying attention to news, you know that he's basically closing down the U.S. aid program. And whether you agree or disagree with that action, the theory that he's using is that, you know, we have to be able to help Americans first before we start helping all these other countries, and that the nature of how that aid is being distributed and how it's being utilized for, in some cases, is actually absurd and ridiculous. So instead of kind of making changes there, he's kind of really closing it down pretty dramatically. And that is impactful both for the United States and the world, particularly as it relates to people who work in that unit, which is more than 25,000 people here in the States. He's re-looking at all our trade agreements. We have close to 24 trade agreements around the world. The largest one is the USMCA with Canada and Mexico. And he wants to rewrite them so that they show more favor to the United States. And a lot of his rhetoric that he points towards Canada and Mexico has to do with the fact that under the USMCA agreements, Canada and Mexico can sell anything they want to into the United States, but the United States companies are restricted as to what we can sell into Mexico and Canada. And he wants to open that up. As an example, the dairy industry, which is very big in upstate New York and upstate Vermont, upstate Michigan, and so forth, that dairy industry cannot sell without surcharges onto their products when they move it into Canada. But the dairy industry in Canada can sell it to the United States without any consequences. So these are the things that he wants to see in those agreements changed. And I will tell you that he's going to likely get those things as this thing moves forward, because the USMCA is not only important to the United States, it's very important to Mexico and Canada. And he's reviewing and looking at all the immigration policies. And his position is that he wants to allow people into the United States that provide value to us and come in a legally registered process and not fleeing across the border illegally. So one of the failures is our congressional delegations, since going back almost 40 years now, have not been able to address a successful immigration policy. So the various presidents that have come along have tried to manage it through their executive orders, but it really should be something that we create a solid immigration policy in the United States, authorized by the Senate and Congress, and then the president administers that program. But that's not the way it's currently being done. Other aspects is the decoupling from China. And again, it's not the fact that he wants to eliminate China as a source. What he wants to do is not to dominate in the manufacturing area as they are now, and to bring back a lot of that manufacturing to the United States. He wants to renegotiate all the trade deals that we have, and he also wants to create new trade deals, and we'll look at that in a moment. So if you're involved in supply chain and you're involved in China, Canada, the EU, or Mexico, the four that I have on here, these are areas that he's clearly going after and targeting pretty aggressively. So in the world of supply chain, you need to be watching the news very carefully and watching how he maneuvers various executive orders and administrative policies that he can address to either make it much more difficult, much more expensive, or much more complicated to move goods from these points into the United States. Areas that he is looking to do trade deals that we've learned. I'm one of 12 companies that's a partner with the Department of Commerce in Washington. And I sit on these boards that we have kind of great access to good information flow. But we have learned that there's potential activity with the UK, which is separated from the EU through the Brexit policy process. He's looking potentially with Japan, Vietnam. And as many of you may know, a lot of the Chinese manufacturing moved down from China into Vietnam. Vietnam has become a very large supplier, particularly in consumer items and fashion industry, textiles, clothing, and so forth, become more important. And obviously, we know we have a very important strategic relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the largest producers of chips and semiconductors in the world. So there's a vital interest in the protection of that country. So having a good trade deal with that country would have a certain value and benefit as well. So we know in these parts of the world, they're being looked at by the administration currently. So Trump has delivered several of these executive orders. I call them first and second salvos. He put 25% on Canada and Mexico, which he then rescinded. He put an additional 10% on China, which does stand. He put de minimis on all countries such as Canada, Mexico, and China, and then rescinded that one as well. In the one between Mexico and Canada, he gave a 30-day reprieve, meaning that in 30 days, if nothing else happens, those restrictions will be in place. But in the movement of the de minimis, he did not give a time frame. And in reality, the issue with de minimis is that we handle in the United States about 1 million transactions a day of de minimis, meaning that goods that come in under $800 of value do not have to be customs cleared or duties being paid. The amount of transactions that come in daily in the United States is about 4 million, and half of that is from China, about 2 million. So it would mean customs would have to be able to handle, and the customs brokerage community of customs brokerage facilities being able to handle an additional 2 million clearances a day, which would almost be a physical impossibility. The technology would not support it, and the manpower wouldn't be there, both with commercial custom brokers, the ACE portal that you work in, and also the customs facility themselves being able to handle that volume. So I'm not sure that de minimis is going to be in the loop of protection, not certainly the way that they're showing it now. The second salvo put 25% on steel and aluminum across the board, no matter where it comes from. And this is a very consequential event because we in the United States only can produce about 40% of what we would use on a daily basis with US manufacturers. So there'll be significant shortage on steel and aluminum, and we'll be forced to increase pricing, but we'll be forced to open up certain countries around the world where we have to import from, one of them being Canada, where we have a significant amount of imports coming in every day in that category of aluminum. But one of the bigger concerns about steel and aluminum is that he's also including products, what we call derivatives. And these means where there's a predominance of steel or aluminum in the manufacturing process of a product. So it's not just raw steel or raw aluminum, but it might be a machine tool that's made of aluminum or made of steel, that these things would come under this additional 25% as well. I saw a study done yesterday by a public utility that said that more than 60 sectors of the United States manufacturing community would be impacted by this steel and aluminum thing very negatively, and would impact the potential loss of a significant amount of jobs, as much as 300,000. So there's a lot of pressure now being put on Trump about this. So we're expecting him to modify the steel and aluminum and maybe make it more country specific, rather than across the board, and open it up for where we do have good, favorable relationships, such as in Canada. He is looking at foreign trade zones, which obviously provide significant benefit. We're a big advocate of foreign trade zones. We're very actively involved in creating foreign trade zones all across the country. But he's putting restrictions if the raw materials or components come from China. There's all kinds of restrictions now in getting the benefits of the FTZ. And appreciate that this is really a starting point of this activity. His rhetoric that he's putting out there is fairly aggressive on all the different things that he intends on doing. And the big concern is this conversation now where he wants to look at our trade relationships with every country in the world, and where there's an imbalance, and appreciate that there's more than 100 countries around the world where we have an imbalance of trade, meaning that we import more than we export to that country. And he's going to take action relative to tariffs on those countries. So we're waiting to see which countries he's going to represent that to happen with, and what extent he's going to do it. And unfortunately, in his first administration, he gave us months and months of time to react to what he was going to put out there. In the last round of salvos 1 and 2 this year, he hasn't given us more than 4 days to respond to his actions, and that in itself is a problem. Gave us 4 days notice on the 25% and the de minimis rules when he put it out. Put it out on a Saturday, and it was effective on Tuesday. It created tremendous disruption here in the United States and the whole world, okay? But fortunately, by the end of the day, it resolved for Mexico and Canada, but not for China. So this concept of disruption from his mindset of negotiation creates some advantages. And from our side, who operate in that world, that disruption and that uncertainty causes chaos. And it makes it very hard to make what we'd call fully educated and fully briefed, informed decisions on how we navigate these responsibilities. So, from that perspective, it's a very negative means of activity, and we have to be very careful, and we have to be paying attention to it very closely. And it clearly demonstrated Mr. Trump's negotiation style, exactly what he's written in his book and how he puts it out there. And he seems to be living up to most of his rhetoric and most of the promises that he's put out there. It's that we don't understand exactly what he's actually trying to achieve. Is it really to put a tariff in to collect more money, or is it put a tariff in to get some other advantage with that country that he's putting that out for? So what we were left with at the end of the day was the 25% additional duty on Mexico and Canada that's on hold for 30 days. So come, I think, March 4th is the date that this is going to have to be reconciled. Otherwise, it goes into effect. He continues to restrict China through executive action on goods and raw materials and components that are sourced in China. The de minimis impact, he's given this reprieve with an indefinite amount of period, where originally we thought it was going to be 30 days, but in fact, for the de minimis, it's open. We don't know how that's going to be resolved. The likely solution that a number of professionals have put forth is to just lower the amount from $800 to maybe $200 and only impact the Chinese origin market. And that would still make the de minimis program still work successfully and not put a significant amount of burden on custom house brokers and customs going forward. So a lot of the lobbying groups that are talking to the administration, that's what they're saying. If you're going to deal with de minimis, then deal with it just relative to China and move the $800 mark to maybe $200, because the majority of goods that come in individually are mostly worth less than $200. So it wouldn't be that impactful in terms of disruption. So the concern that we have, besides all this disruption and uncertainty and this roller coaster of activity, is the retaliation that's already starting to take place. China has done two things. One is they're one of the largest suppliers in the world of certain types of elements that we need, precious metals and materials, rare earth metals, minerals, and so forth. And they've started to put restrictions now, specifically on sales to the United States of those products that we need. And they put a 15% tariff on certain products that come from the United States, particularly the ones that they buy in high volume. So the agricultural industry, the coal industry would be two industries that would be impacted by these new tariffs and so forth. So Mexico and Canada have already said if the 25% came into place, that they're ready to deal with tariffs on US products coming in. So of all the companies that are involved in exporting to these countries, you have to be watching this carefully, because you may now be uncompetitive or may have to charge higher costs to your customers. So retaliation is a big issue here. And you hear in the news this continuation of conversation that he's creating a trade war. And the last time the United States was in a trade war was between 1930 and 1934. And it did not work out well for not only the United States, but most of the world. It was 4 years of extreme cost escalations and extreme uncertainty in trade that occurred in those 4-year period that they had this huge trade war going on. So we do not want it to happen if it could be avoided. So one of the things, because I've been following this now for almost 40 years, the trade policies of the United States. And the United States really has not had a trade policy, almost going back all the way to Nixon. It was the Nixon Doctrine, which came out that discussed this, but it wasn't really very strong. So Trump has now, in 3 different press interviews, has discussed the fact that he wants to formulate a trade policy, which they're going to call the Trump Doctrine, which kind of lays out for the American businesses and the commercial world outside of the United States, how we're going to navigate this. And when you do that, that has to then go through a congressional and Senate approval process so that you'll be able to bring other viewpoints into what he's looking to accomplish, so that it becomes, the policy becomes something that's going to be carried forward over a long period of time. And I think it's really sorely needed that the Americans kind of announce, here's how we're going to navigate trade with the rest of the world over the next so many years. So when you think about all these things that we've talked about, which create disruption, chaos, uncertainty, and so forth, appreciate the fact that various times over the last 50 years, the United States and the world has had tremendous amount of disruptive events occur. So over those disruptive events, and COVID being the last one that we had 4 years ago, that we have developed as consultants in international business 19 different solutions that a company can actually look at to mitigate the impact of that disruptive event. So that subject would be an hour-and-a-half conversation all by itself. We don't have time. So I've selected 6 of the 19 to kind of talk through so that you get an idea and a frame of how you would navigate this thing. So duties is determined by where something is from and its HTS number. The HTS number is decided based upon what the product is following what's called the general rules of interpretation, coming up with a harmonized tariff number. But we, as importers into the United States or as exporters, we can legitimately manipulate how a product is manufactured, what its materials are. What if you look at the bill of materials, where things originate from and their value, and when we manipulate it, maybe we can manipulate it so it creates a different harmonized tariff number, and therefore we pay a lower duty rate. And tariff engineering is actually a very big aspect of companies that are involved in manufacturing and distribution, is working with their suppliers overseas, to be able to, change how something is made legitimately, okay, to get a different harmonized tariff number and therefore a lower duty rate. Direct shipping, one of the things we look at is we see a lot of goods come from overseas. They be brought into a U.S. warehouse, and then they're shipped to a final customer. And we ask the question, what value add was given in that warehouse? Did they do something to the product? Is there anything that differentiates it? Is there anything that's added in, and so forth? In many cases, and actually more cases than not, there is no value added. It's just a distribution point. So what we've set up is, as an example, if you were shipping from China, we've set up in 9 locations in China now, points to receive goods from Chinese suppliers, where the fulfillment service and the distribution service comes right out of China. And what you eliminate is the product having to come into your facility, incur all the costs of delivery, cost of storage, cost of insurance and overhead, and do your distribution directly from the overseas market. We have this capability in about 34 different countries now, but China obviously is a big one. And we've been able to impact the overall landed cost by as much as 25 to 30% when you evade having to come to a U.S. distribution center and just ship directly from your supplier. And you can change at your forwarder's location in China, these 9 locations, any documentation that points to a particular origin company, and you can create all U.S. documentation that follows the freight going to the end customer. Demand planning. Air freight is 18 times more expensive than ocean freight. And that's a concern, obviously, if we have a budget of cost. So the question comes into, why do we end up using air freight? There could be legitimate reasons, but more likely it's a result that we have to rush goods because the planning process didn't work successfully. So we look at then, why isn't the demand planning process working successfully? It's based upon basically historical data, seasonal information, and predictive data of what the future need might be. And it's that predictive area in which there's usually failure, and therefore the demand planning is off, and the result is that we have to air freight things and pay 18 times more. So what we work on then is the demand planning process to make it as accurate as it possibly can be. And the real key element is working with your customers, your manufacturing locations, to really create predictive data, which is more aligned with what it actually is rather than just an intelligent guess. Alternative sourcing. When we look at China now and this whole decoupling from China, and again, our recommendation is not to eliminate China, but to reduce your dependence on China. There's a lot of different places that you can alternatively source today, where you can maybe not reduce your acquisition cost, but you can reduce your landed cost, which is the accumulation of cost to get it to point to value. Countries like Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Philippines, India, and Mexico. And particularly in Mexico, there's a program called the Maquiladora program, which provides significant value for U.S. companies in manufacturing and assembly work. Foreign trade zones. The World Trade Center of Denver is the grantee in that general vicinity surrounding the city of Denver. And foreign trade zones are great tools to use where you can defer duty obligations, lower duty obligations, lower the costs of importing and exporting pretty significantly. And you can affect landed costs by as much as 20 to 30% by the use of foreign trade zones. And they're all available all over the United States, not just in Denver. And lastly is robust supply chain assessments. On the prior slide, those 19 solutions, they come out of an assessment where you look at your entire supply chain model from where the goods originate from, as it moves through the logistics process, as it moves through manufacturing or quality control, as it moves to the last mile of the delivery, taking apart each aspect of that transaction and seeing where there's an opportunity to reduce risk and spend. Again, the 5 key areas in dissecting landed costs is the acquisition cost of the product, the freight to move it from A to B, the customs clearance process, duties and taxes, which is usually a huge number. Okay, and obviously, if Trump continues to move forward as it is, it's going to be a bigger number as the landed cost. And then where we're located from where we do the last mile delivery and do our fulfillment and distribution from is also impactful in terms of how things are costed out. We created a 4-step process. We assess as the first step. We create recommendations and a financial model to make sure that any changes made are going to have a return on investment. We move into an operation model, which answers the question, what do we have to do differently to make this benefit happen for us? And lastly is implementation, okay, which is actually making the recommendation be effective within your supply chain. So some general thoughts to end with. Pay attention to the government, Trump administration, the news and the media, and would say not to use one source, but use multiple sources so you could discern between the political slants that are sometimes put in the news media. Appreciate the fact that there's going to be more restrictive changes coming, so to try to get that into your mindset and prepare for it. Be proactive on the mitigating strategies that you have. Example would be, we know China is going to continually be attacked, so reducing your dependence on China is a definite strategy. Think both short-term and long-term. Increase safety stock levels. Before COVID, safety stock levels were in the 6 to 10% range for most companies. Through COVID, it grew to almost more than 200%. And now it's leveling out probably in the 60 to 70% level that most companies are keeping and so forth. But the idea is that, when you have potential uncertainty and disruption, you want to have more in stock than you think you might need. And manage your suppliers more diligently and dip down to their primary suppliers. So if you have a huge supplier, you want to look at their tier 1, tier 2 suppliers that come to them to make sure you really have a pretty good understanding of how products, components, raw materials move so that you won't be negatively impacted. Increase your negotiating and problem resolution skills. There are lots of programs that are available to do that. Continue intense training in all aspects of global supply chain management and operations, such as a seminar, webinar that we're doing here. Attend industry trade shows along with supply chain associations. The World Trade Center of Denver has a huge annual event that they have in the city of Denver, where they bring in all these people from all aspects of international trade and business and supply chain. And it's a great event that really provides a tremendous amount of information flow. Build external resources. With Trump, differentiate between the rhetoric, the saber rattling, and substance. And that's something that is both an art and a science, but appreciate the fact that he has a lot of rhetoric out there and he has a lot of saber rattling, okay? And you have to try to figure out how much of it is just that rhetoric and saber rattling and how much of it is actually substance. And become CTPAT certified. That's the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. It's a voluntary program with U.S. Customs for both importers and exporters. And it kind of helps you raise your profile with Customs and other government agencies that you run a more secure, compliant supply chain, and you get benefits from that have impacts. And appreciate that there's also industry specific, and this is kind of a generic presentation, but I happened to give one to the Food Industry Association the other day, and there are examples that are unique to specific industries. Okay, appreciate that. The government, everybody who works for the government today is being impacted dramatically. Some are losing their jobs, some are being asked to retire early, some just are giving up and saying that I want to work for this particular administration and leaving. So that's already put pressure on a lot of government agencies that process international transactions, such as the FDA and the USDA, US Customs, and so forth. Appreciate the fact that we have a huge trade business that goes, to and from Mexico and Canada, and Trump rhetorically and to some extent is targeting Mexico and more specifically Canada as well. He's also recognizes where most of the immigrants are coming from, and it's not actually Mexico, it's actually the countries that are south of Mexico, from Guatemala, El Salvador, Venezuela, Colombia, and so forth. And so he's looking at maneuvering against those countries. EU for sure, China for sure, okay? He's looking at all the agencies involved in importing and exporting and going to change how they handle the responsibilities to favor the United States. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as an example, was changed the other day, in which it prevents a U.S. company or executive from, in his negotiations, to get a deal overseas where he might bribe a government official overseas as an illegal act here in the United States, and can be gone after criminally and civilly. And he's basically done away with that because he thinks that that law prevents the United States from negotiating more favorable deals and so forth. And that's a huge impact because more than 100 companies a year get prosecuted by the Department of Justice for that type of unfair utilization. So we'll see where that all ends up going. The Consumer Protection Commission is being impacted, that protects the consumer against things that get imported that they meet minimum standards. Okay. And we're all now concerned now about the overall trend of freight pricing capacity, because the steamship lines, the airlines, the trucking companies, drayers want to position their assets where they believe trade is going to. And when you have uncertainty, that means they're taking a guess as to where it happens, and they could potentially position things incorrectly that has an impact not only to all industries, but to ones that are industry specific, such as the food industry, which I spoke to the other day. So with that, I appreciate everybody's kind attention, and if there are any questions or anything, shoot them at me and we'll be more happy to close answering those questions. So I thank the World Trade Center of Denver and everybody's kind attention.
Thank you so much, Tom, for sharing your insights and providing your expertise in this matter. We do have a couple of questions and we have a couple of minutes for them. So the first question that we received is there a location where we can locate tariffs and possible exclusions in place on HTS codes in a spreadsheet format or a software system? When managing thousands of part numbers, it is difficult to rapidly evaluate impacts through manually clicking through the PDFs.
So what I'll do, Tanya, is I'll send an email to you with answering that question, because I can't do it off the top of my head, but I know we have it in our office, and then you can put it out to everybody who attended the event. But I'll give you the websites you can go to for determining classifications and exclusions, and also the various technologies that might be available and so forth that does that work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to share a slide, so if you don't mind me.
Not at all.
Let's see if it'll allow me. Okay, can you see the screen now? Perfect. All right. So thank you again, everybody who attended our first briefing. Again, our main goal is to inform and bring variety of opinions and insights and different trade professionals from different industry, from different angles, so that we all can make better decisions. And Tom has shared some of the strategies that are recommended to be prepared for that. But I did want to highlight that we do have next week trade briefing with Jack Caporal. And so he's gonna cover overview of recent executive orders impacting trade and a little bit of history on trade policy as well. He's chair of our trade policy committee here at World Trade Center Denver. So I hope you all can register and be with us next week. I think it's very important to stay as a community, to stay informed, to share sources. And as Tom also what you said, that there is so much information going on, and sometimes just being informed, follow the news is extremely important. With that, I wish everybody wonderful Wednesday. Stay warm here if you're in Colorado, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.